It's a whitewash, a complete flop. The recommendations of the PWC inquiry are out, and they are so pusillanimous that you couldn't have paid even PWC itself to do a better job. But before we take the long handle to this final report and give it the drubbing it so richly deserves, let's balance things up and look on the bright side. Do the glass half full routine. The report recommendations are a washout with its 12 boring recommendations, just tinkering at the edges. We'll get to those in a moment, one by one. But the process, we must say, was an important one. Many of you will have seen the clips coming out of the Senate inquiry into consultants. 14 months, 60 submissions, umpteen grillings of government people, politicians, and Big Four consultants, because it's not all about just PWC, it's the other Big Four, EY, Deloitte, and KPMG. Peas in a pod. Now, the good news is that the politicians, some of the politicians on this committee and the associated public servants did their work very well, exposing the rot in government. This is essentially a story about the privatisation, the outsourcing of government itself, which has happened over the last 10 or 15 years. These inquiries are our politicians, our elected leaders at their best, probing and demanding information, exposing all the lies, the greed, the protection rackets, the incompetence, the cover-ups, the lavish fees for no service, all on display. And particular commendation should go to Barbara Pocock and to Deborah O'Neill, two senators who were excellent. They were intrepid and relentless in their interrogations and their work. There's some other people on the inquiry which aren't so great and didn't do a lot, and that is worth mentioning because this is how the recommendations are so feeble, because it's not up to O'Neill or Barbara Pocock to make recommendations. It's up to the committee. And if you have a look at who's on the committee, well, they come and they go. I mean, we quite like he's an honest toiler, the old Dean Smith. He's a Liberal, but you've got at the helm is the Honourable Senator Richard Colbeck, a couple of lower profile Labor people, Louise Pratt and so on, and you've got good old Dave Sharma, who's just arrived, 18 March 2024, so he would have had a hand in it. He replaced Dean Smith. The Honourable Senator James McGrath and a few others. So, here we are. David Pocock had a stint on there as well, but you've got basically the committee stacked with Lib-Lab coalition members, dominated by the Libs, it looks like, with the chair a Liberal, and although the report goes through and identifies all the problems with this privatisation of the Australian government, but the recommendations are very weak. Now, if you go through the report, you will find a section in there by the Greens, so they could let off some steam and have their say. The Great Swindle, they called it. But the report wasn't the Great Swindle. The final report into the Management and Assurance of Integrity by Consulting Services, as it's formally named, the PWC inquiry, is hardly independent, because you see Labor and Liberals get millions of dollars in donations from the Big Four. They always have, year after year, hundreds of thousands from each of them. The Greens presumably don't get any for them, so they can be independent in their assessment of this situation. It's just protection money. The Big Four have paid them off, and the recommendations are basically business as usual, which we're going to get to in a moment, because the report does deal with the problem issues, and the Greens' remarks are very well worth reading. But the recommendations, of course, are a travesty. And the bad news with these inquiries is they always make recommendations and never do anything about them anyway, or rarely. Banking Royal Commission, whatever the inquiry is. But it's not a completely useless exercise in our view, because it leads to a moderation in behaviour. And this is the politician's job, to probe these kind of things, and some of them do it quite well. We pay them to do that job, and they expose all the shenanigans going on in this consulting sector and the Himalayan waste of money that is paying consultants to do government work. So because of what came out during this inquiry, very entertaining stuff. And although now we feel like the teenager who's been waiting for the party on Saturday night then turns up and there's nobody there, but it has exposed the excesses of privatisation and butt covering. Just a very simple perspective here. Who had the brain explosion that it would be more efficient for government to outsource government to replace thousands of public servants paid, say, $50 an hour with thousands of richly remunerated consultants paid $400 or $500 an hour? In what universe is it a good idea to replace outside people that have to learn new things with people who are much cheaper and who know what they are doing, presumably? It's redolent of the great Australian gas strategy report, which came down a month or so ago, where essentially they were asking us to believe that drilling for more gas would lead to lower emissions. It just doesn't make sense, just like the privatisation of government. I mean, check out The Scoop by Stuart McCarthy, a former army officer, on MWM Today, up near the top of the page. The Department of Veterans Affairs paid consultants PWC $73 million to forestall a royal commission as part of a $1 billion program intended to avoid reforming not fit-for-purpose legislation. PWC was paid to not reform. I mean, the thing is a monumental scam, this use of consultants. Not only are the Big Four adding spectacularly to the cost of government, they are literally deployed to impede good government. But for context, this is essentially a story about failed privatisation of government. And we have some personal experience with it because we've been on it for 15 years. When we were at 9 Facts, the Sydney Morning Herald, we were a lone voice going on about this accident, this train wreck waiting to happen, going on about how these people were milking the bureaucracy. In fact, the very first story that we did when we set up the website and went into independent journalism was about this broken system and the massive conflicts of interest. Indeed, the final report into PWC does find that there are conflicts of interest and identifies all the problems. It's just the recommendations or the politics of it which is the problem. You see, these Big Four firms started out as humble auditors, and we've been rabbiting on about them since 2016. The first story, Oligarchs of the Treasure Islands, featuring a former Big Four partner, George Rosvaney, who basically went on about how they were sucking billions out of Australian dollars to foreign tax havens, how they had huge conflict of interest over the other side of the so-called Chinese wall because they were auditing the same companies that they were giving advice to on how to scam the government on tax. This was mid-2016. To quote George, the Big Four have, under a Rasputin-like cloak of illusion, strayed from their original and critical role of verifying the accuracy of financial accounts for all stakeholders to be accountants of fortune, merely representing the accounting position for multinationals and developing aggressive international tax avoidance practices. It wasn't too many years later that it all came out. But in between, we're hammering them on a number of issues. You see, the essential conflict here is not just between auditing, where you've got to sign off on financial statements as being true and fair, and the other guys over the other side of the Chinese wall signing off on tax strategies about how they can rip off the government as much as they possibly can without getting dragged into the federal court. That is a massive conflict of interest because these guys advise, tax advice and audit services, 95% of the biggest companies in the world. The big US tech companies, the big mining companies, the big manufacturers, the automakers, all of them. It's the Big Four. They are ubiquitous. But it was around 2014, it was around Tony Abbott's era, that we noticed that their fees from consulting began to take off. You couldn't see it in their accounts because they don't produce accounts themselves. They are shady, opaque partnerships, but you could see it in the gigs they were getting in government. So they started to make big bucks, not just from audit and tax, but from telling the government how to go about its business, and corporate consulting as well. Until then, until Tony Abbott, there'd been a bit of consultancy, but it went ballistic after that. If you look at the charts, and we've done many of these, it just goes through the roof. Hundreds of millions of dollars, peaking with ScoMo, hundreds of millions of dollars a year in consulting. And their actual income, they've only got to report a revenue figure once a year. That's their only statutory obligation in terms of disclosure and transparency. These guys, all four of them, year in, year out, have been making double-digit rises in revenue, not profits, but revenue, milking the fat cow of government bureaucracy and the states as well, and often getting signed on just so that a bureaucrat can do some butt covering, get somebody else to stick their imprimatur on whatever project it is. So to have a look at these recommendations, because I'll tell you, they are farcical in their feebleness. If we have a look at these recommendations. So here they are, the recommendations. Recommendation 1, the committee recommends the PWC be open and honest with the Australian Parliament and people and with the international community by promptly publishing accurate and detailed information, blah, blah, blah. Well, that horse has bolted, and they're still refusing to obey the directions of the Senate when it comes to providing names of people involved in their great tax rort, where they were advising the government on new tax laws and telling their multinational clients how to skive out of paying tax on those very laws. It was treason, effectively, selling state secrets for profits. Nobody, David McBride, a whistleblower, is in jail for doing the right thing. And these guys have been busted with $1 billion rort, betraying the government, betraying every Australian. And here they are. The committee recommends the PWC be open and honest. Well, it's a bit late for that when there's so much money involved. Recommendation 2, the committee recommends that the Department of Finance update the contract management guide to require the Australian government contracts, So there we go. They're recommending the Department of Finance update a guide. Well, that's a very hard-hitting one, isn't it? No one's going to jail there. The committee recommends, in recommendation 3, that the Department of Finance improve the training of officials undertaking procurement, in the APS. So, recommendation 3 basically blames the poor old public servants and says that they're going to have to go and do some training. A bit like the ABC recommending counselling for Laura Tingle. It's their fault, apparently, that they've been hoodwinked by these highly paid grifters from the Big Four. Mind you, we do note that these are people too. People are people, and they're just doing their jobs, milking that fat cow. And there are many very good people at the Big Four, just like anywhere else. It is the system that's broken, and this will do nothing to reform it. Recommendation 4, the committee recommends that the transfer of knowledge from the consultant to the APS be factored into design, management and evaluation of contracts. Right, okay, so in other words, the consultant has to let the government, their client, know what's going on, impart some knowledge. Whoa, that's a big one, isn't it? Recommendation 4. Recommendation 5. The committee recommends that the Department of Finance amend the Supplier Code of Conduct to include a requirement for service providers to act in the public interest. Oh, they'll be frightened about that one, won't they? Having to comply with Recommendation 5, that the Department of Finance amend a code of conduct. Recommendation 6, the committee recommends that the Department of Finance review its guidance on conflicts of interest and provide a clear and consistent definition of what constitutes a conflict of interest. Oh, they've got to identify their conflicts of interest. The only answer here, really, in real terms, is to bust these people up so there aren't any conflicts of interest, because their conflicts of interest are too great to operate with integrity. But there's no recommendations here saying break up the Big Four. You can't be auditor, tax advisor and consultant at the same time. That would fix the conflicts of interest. Recommendation 7, the committee recommends that the Department of Finance develop a central register for conflicts of interest breaches for use by government entities. Well, this will be useful for journalists like myself. At least we'll be able to go to one central register for conflicts of interest. Who's ever going to look at it? That will be wholeheartedly ignored. Nobody will ever know anything about it. By the end of this video, that will be the last time anybody's even spoken those words. Develop a central register for conflicts of interest. Recommendation 8. Committee recommends that the Department of Finance improve the usability of AusTender. Please improve your usability. Department of Finance, it's all your fault. Recommendation 9. The committee recommends that the government commissions the Australian Law Reform Commission to undertake a review of the legislative frameworks and structures of partnership. So the committee recommends that another committee or commissions a commission or another appropriate body to undertake nothing more than a review. Haven't we had enough reviews? Recommendation 10. The committee recommends that the Australian government require those organisations that operate professional standards as self-regulated, to report annually on the operation of those standards to a joint standing committee on corporation financial services. So in this one, this hard-hitting recommendation 10, the problem, of course, here is that there are no regulators. It's self-regulation, which doesn't work, clearly. It hasn't worked. We've been robbed billions of dollars so consultants can buy their holiday houses with our taxes. So this one goes to the problem, which indeed the report does too, because self-regulation doesn't work. There's no professional standards board for consultants. You can do or say what you want. And conveniently, the audit side of the business, they just say, well, consultants aren't auditors, so we don't have to, adhere to any standards that professional audit regulators might demand. Not that those are very high, those are exceedingly low, as the previous Big Four inquiry led by none other than James Patterson found, the world's most hopeless inquiry of all time. A 30-pager with 4 or 5 blank pages and nothing to say for itself. That was the last time. Then 1 or 2 years later, of course, this blows up. There is no regulation. These guys are too big. They're too powerful. They're beyond regulation. And they're milking us all. I mean, imagine ASIC going after PWC. Imagine the poor little regulator at ASIC saying to his boss, I'm going to bring a case against PWC. You'd be laughed out of the room, for goodness sake. Do you know who they are? Recommendation 11. We're almost done. The committee recommends that the Parliament legislate to establish a joint standing committee to review and approve consultancy service contracts. Okay, fair enough. The committee has actually recommended that there be some legislation, not just a review or another committee to look into a committee or a commission be commissioned to look into a commission. They've recommended a law to establish a joint standing committee to review and approve consultancy and services contracts. They'll probably get PWC commissioned to set up this joint standing committee. I mean, at least it's a law. It's a recommendation for a law. And finally, these robust, draconian recommendations, we arrive at recommendation 12. That the committee recommends that the Senate pass the following order. There be laid on the table by the Minister for Finance biannual statements on expenditure on consultancy contracts, anything over $2 million. All public service departments and agencies. Okay. Fair enough. It's a bit of fiddling and more fiddling around the edges, but at least there's a bit of disclosure there. It's a Senate order. Will they obey it? Who knows? Nobody is going to be quaking in their boots this day as a result of these findings and these recommendations. But disclosure and transparency is a good idea because there is not enough. If these guys were companies, these Big Four, they would have to disclose financial statements. We'd know more about them, where the revenue came from. It's just, I don't think there is even a peak body for consultants. A bit like economists. There's no peak body even. There's no professional standards. You can do what you like. Going further in recommendation 12, biannual reporting. The statements are due, Each report is to include in relation to dollar value, subject matter, duration, This is good. More disclosure of what we are actually paying these people to do, because sometimes it's very hazy and often it's nothing. As the Barbara Pocock and Deb O'Neill found when they were grilling the Big Four partners during their sessions, often very entertaining sessions. They found that often, it was like the banks with their fees for no service. that they couldn't explain these people what they were being paid to do. It's not really about that anyway. It's just about getting money out of people, because the government is an easy touch. It's an easy touch because they don't want to be responsible for their decisions, so they get PWC to do it. They've lost some skin in this PWC, and all this entire process will lead to a moderation of behaviour and more vigilant public servants. So it hasn't been a waste of time. But these recommendations are a complete and utter joke. We've been on about this Big Four for a long time, and it doesn't look as though there's going to be any significant change to a system where you have 4 global firms that operate effectively above the laws of the Commonwealth government. They are indeed the accountants of fortune, just having a real crack to dig money out of any crevice that they can find it, whether it be corporate or government. It is a scam. Not to say that these people are any better or worse, but it is a massive grift. And the outsourcing of government has done irreparable damage, because you don't get that expertise back once you've sacked all these people. We've been through it personally in the mainstream media with 5 redundancies in 8 years when I was last in the mainstream media in one newspaper shop. You don't get those people back with decades each of expertise. It is gone. It needs to be rebuilt, because as my old colleague Anthony Clan, who's an independent journalist, found recently, having sold their consultancy business to a mob called Skive or Skine or something, another private equity mob, PWC then pretended not to be in consulting, and then suddenly they're back in the game, putting their little hands up for more government money. It is a total rort, and it's hard to see with these recommendations how this rort will be addressed. And it's in every government department. Defence is notorious. Tens of millions of dollars each every year for the Big Four, for paper shuffling. No wonder defence is such a joke. Anyway, there you have it. My final report into this final report. It's not very good. Thank you for your support here. We really appreciate it. Please like, share and comment in the section below.